A Tuesday afternoon in October. Nothing particular about the day. No appointment circled on the calendar, no urgency pulling at anything. A man sits at his kitchen table. The table is clean. The light through the window is ordinary. There's a mug of coffee nearby, half finished. A pair of reading glasses rests on the tabletop next to a laptop that's already open. Or maybe it's a paper form pulled from a manila envelope that arrived 2 days ago and has been sitting on the counter since. The envelope was from a financial institution. Not a bill, not a notice, a routine update request. The kind of thing that comes around every few years when a company updates its records or merges with another firm or revises its compliance process. He opened the envelope because he opens everything. He's not the kind of man who lets mail pile up. He reads it, handles it, files it, or discards it. That's how things work in his house. There is no second person to remind him. There is no argument about whose job it is. Things get done because he does them. The form itself is simple. Account holder name, social security number, address confirmation, contact information. A few boxes about communication preferences. Routine. Then the form reaches a section near the bottom. Primary beneficiary. A line for a name, a line for relationship, a line for percentage. Below that, contingent beneficiary. Same structure, name, relationship, percentage. He reads the lines. He understands what they're asking. This is not new vocabulary. He's seen these words before on other forms, on insurance documents, on retirement account paperwork. He knows what a beneficiary is. He knows what contingent means. He's not confused. But he pauses. Not a dramatic pause, not the kind of pause that happens in a film when the music shifts. Just a pause. His pen stays where it is, or his cursor doesn't move. He looks at the blank fields for a moment longer than the rest of the form seemed to require. And in that pause, something very quiet becomes visible. Here is a man who has been responsible for decades. He pays his taxes early. He monitors his investments. He has homeowner's insurance or renter's insurance or whatever kind of insurance the structure of his life requires. His car registration is current. His appliances work because he maintains them or replaces them on schedule. He has passwords organized. He has records. He is not someone who avoids administration. He is someone who runs administration as a private discipline. There is no board of directors. There is no spouse reviewing the file. No adult child asking when the paperwork will be done. The system works because he built it, and he operates it every month, every quarter, every year. And yet, the form sits in front of him with 2 blank lines. Those lines have been blank in some version or another for a long time. Not because he forgot, but because the form is asking a question that his life has not yet answered in administrative language. Who receives what you've built? Most forms assume this question has already been answered by the shape of a life. A married man writes his wife's name. A father writes his children. A man with a longtime partner writes that partner's name. Even a man with a complicated family usually has someone whose placement on the form would not require extended thought. The system was designed around these assumptions. Not maliciously, just practically. Most people who accumulate assets over decades do so inside a family structure, and the beneficiary line reflects that expectation. Name, relationship, percentage. Simple. But for a man who is never married and has no children, the line doesn't reflect anything simple. He may have people in his life, a brother he talks to occasionally, a sister whose kids he's watched grow up from a distance, a friend he's known for 30 years, a colleague who became something close to a confidant over time, a neighbor who checks in, a nephew who calls sometimes. None of these people are wrong answers, but none of them are the obvious answer either. None of them stand in the position where the form expects someone to stand. The form doesn't ask who he cares about. It asks who is his designated recipient in the event of his death. And those are not the same question. The pause at the kitchen table is not about money, not primarily. The accounts are what they are. Some men have more than expected. Some have less than they'd prefer. The number isn't the issue. The issue is that the money has been accumulated with precision, and the destination has not been determined with the same precision. He can tell you what he owns. He can tell you where it's held. He can probably tell you the approximate balance without checking. He knows his contribution limits, his withdrawal rules, his tax obligations. The architecture of accumulation is tight. The architecture of distribution is blank. The question of distribution, for a man in his position, opens a set of considerations that 3 lines on a form were never designed to hold. That blank field is not just an empty box on a document. It's a junction point where a private life meets an institutional requirement. The institution doesn't know this man. It doesn't know his history, his relationships, his reasons for living the way he's lived. It doesn't care. The institution knows one thing. When this account holder is no longer alive, the assets in this account must go somewhere. If a beneficiary is named, the assets go to that person. If not, the assets enter a process. That process has rules. Those rules were not written by this man. They were written by the state, the institution, the legal framework governing intestate transfer or default distribution. The blank line is not neutral territory. A blank beneficiary field is a decision that hasn't been made. And when no decision is made, the system makes one instead. He knows this. Somewhere. Maybe not in those exact words, but he understands the general principle. He's a competent man. He reads documents. He follows the news enough to know that estate disputes happen, that money gets tangled, that families argue over assets after someone dies. He's heard stories. And still, the line is blank. He's past 50. He doesn't think he's immortal. He's had the blood work done. He's aware of the numbers. He's watched peers get diagnosed with things. He knows what aging does. He is not in denial about the general trajectory. But there is a difference between knowing you will die and knowing who should carry forward the financial structure you built. The first is abstract. The second is specific. And specificity in this area requires a kind of clarity that no one has taught him to produce. Nobody teaches this. Not in school, not in professional life, not in the casual conversations men have over meals or during halftime or in the parking lot after a meeting. There is no cultural script for the never-married man who needs to designate a beneficiary and doesn't have an obvious name to write. The married man has a script. The father has a script. Even the divorced man usually has a script because his children still exist as default recipients. But the man at this kitchen table has no default. He has only a blank line and the accumulated weight of a responsible life sitting above it. He is not the only man sitting at a table like this. There are millions of men in the United States over 50 who have never married. The exact number shifts depending on which survey you reference, but the figure is large and growing. These are not men who fell through some crack in the social order. Many of them are professionals, engineers, accountants, tradesmen, IT specialists, government employees, small business owners, military veterans, men who have built functional lives inside functional systems. Some chose not to marry. Some expected to marry and the timing never worked. Some had long relationships that didn't lead to legal union. Some simply lived, and the years passed, and marriage became a door they walked past rather than through. The reasons vary. The reasons are private, and the reasons, for the purposes of this conversation, don't actually matter. What matters is the structural condition. A man without a spouse or direct descendant faces a different relationship to beneficiary designation than a man with either of those things. The difference is not emotional, it is architectural. The scaffolding that most estate planning, most insurance paperwork, most financial institution protocols are built upon assumes the presence of at least one default heir. When that default heir doesn't exist, the entire framework shifts. And the shift is quiet. No alarm sounds, no advisor calls, no institution sends a letter saying, "We notice your beneficiary line has been blank for 11 years. The system simply waits. The blank line doesn't set anything in motion while the man is alive and active. That's part of the problem. There is no present tense consequence to an empty beneficiary field. The money stays in the account. The investments grow or shrink according to the market. The man continues to contribute, withdraw, rebalance, review. Everything works. The blank line creates no friction in his daily experience. The blank line also creates a kind of false confidence, because everything else on the form is completed, because the account is well managed, because the statements arrive and are reviewed and filed. The blank line sits inside a context of competence, and that context makes it easy to treat as a minor administrative gap rather than what it actually is. And what it actually is runs deeper than paperwork. The blank line is waiting for a decision that touches identity, relationship, meaning, and the final expression of a life's economic effort. That is a large amount of weight for one line to carry. And when a man has no default heir to absorb that weight automatically, the line stays blank because the decision is hard in a way that most administrative tasks are not. Here is the first structural reversal of this conversation. The pause at the kitchen table is not a symptom of disorder. It is a symptom of a life that was designed around present competence rather than downstream transfer. And that is not a failure. That is the architecture of a self-managed life encountering a question it was not built to answer quickly. The beneficiary form is the first institutional surface where a man's private order meets the system's need for explicit continuation. It is the place where a life of quiet, competent maintenance is asked to name what happens when the maintainer is gone. That question is not small, and a blank answer is not nothing. It is a signal that the man has reached the boundary between the life he controls and the process he doesn't. This is not a conversation about what he should do. This is not advice. This is not a guided meditation on mortality. This is not a motivational appeal to get his affairs in order. He doesn't need that and wouldn't tolerate it even if it were offered. This is an examination of a structural condition, a description of what is actually happening inside a specific category of American life that is large, growing, under-discussed, and architecturally distinct from the life that most financial and legal systems were designed to serve. The man at the table is not broken. He is not incomplete. He is not a cautionary tale. He is a man whose operational system works exceptionally well for every day, except the ones he won't be present for. And the question of what happens on those days is not a matter of sentiment. It is a matter of structure. A blank beneficiary line is not empty paperwork. It is an unassigned continuation point in a life that has otherwise been assigned with care. He starts to think about who the name on that line might be, not in the abstract, practically, sitting there, pen in hand or cursor blinking. He runs through the possibilities. He's methodical about most things, and this is no different. He considers each person the way he might consider a contractor, not coldly, but with the same instinct for fit, for reliability, for whether the designation actually makes sense. There is a brother, maybe. They talk a few times a year, holidays, a birthday. The occasional text about a shared memory. The relationship is not hostile, it's just settled into a particular distance. Would the brother be surprised to receive a substantial sum? Probably. Would the brother know what to do with it? Maybe. Would the brother's spouse have opinions about it? Almost certainly. There was a niece in her late 20s. She's smart, she works hard. He likes her. He has watched her grow up in the way an uncle watches from a moderate distance, attending the milestones he's invited to, sending checks at graduations, asking about her career at family dinners. She's a reasonable candidate, but putting her name on the line feels like it means something beyond money. It declares a bond that is real but also curated. He didn't raise her. He doesn't know her daily life. There is a friend. 25 years of shared history, dinners, fishing trips, the kind of phone calls where neither person explains the context because both already have it. He trusts this man. But naming a friend as a financial beneficiary is unusual in American culture. It crosses a boundary that most friendships don't cross. It introduces money into a space that was defined by its absence. There is a charitable cause. He's given money before, small amounts, annual contributions. He respects the work, but making an organization the primary beneficiary of his life savings feels like an act of finality he isn't ready to perform. It feels like writing an ending to a story he still considers mid-chapter. And there is the option of doing nothing, leaving the line blank, putting the form on the counter where it sat before, telling himself he'll get to it. Not lying exactly, just deferring. Because deferral, for a man who handles everything else on time, feels like a small exception in an otherwise disciplined system. But deferral, stripped of its comfort, is the transfer of a decision from a man who knows his own life to a system that does not. When no beneficiary is named, the assets don't disappear. They enter a process. That process varies by state, by account type, by institution, but the general principle is consistent. When explicit instructions are absent, default rules take over. Those default rules were written for the general population. They assume family structures. They prioritize spouses, then children, then parents, then siblings, then extended kin. They proceed through a hierarchy that may or may not reflect the actual relationships this man has built. For a man with a wife and 2 children, the default rules probably align closely enough with what he would have chosen. The system's guess and his intent overlap. For a man with no spouse, no children, and a network of relationships that don't fit neatly into a legal hierarchy, the default rules are not a guess. They are an imposition. They assign his money based on blood proximity, not on trust, closeness, shared history, or deliberate choice. His sister, who he hasn't spoken to in 4 years, might rank higher in the legal hierarchy than the friend who drove him to the hospital last March. His estranged cousin in another state might technically precede the neighbor who has his spare key and knows where his important documents are kept. The system doesn't evaluate quality of relationship. It evaluates category of relationship. And for a man whose meaningful connections don't correspond to legal categories, the default system is not a safety net. It is a translation error. This is where the conversation shifts. It stops being about one man at one kitchen table. It becomes about the structural mismatch between how a certain category of men actually live and how the systems around them assume they live. The financial system assumes a family unit. The insurance system assumes a household. The estate system assumes heirs. The healthcare proxy system assumes someone with legal standing and emotional investment in the outcome. The emergency contact system assumes someone who can be reached quickly and who has context. For men who live inside those assumptions, the systems function smoothly. The gears turn, the forms get filled. For men who live outside those assumptions, the systems still function, but they function on procedural logic, not personal logic. And procedural logic, by definition, was designed for someone else. A never-married man past 50 who has maintained his independence for decades has usually built something substantial. Not necessarily in net worth, though that may also be true. Substantial in operational competence. His bills are paid, not because someone else reminds him, because his system handles it. Autopay, or a calendar entry, or a monthly routine that includes sitting down and processing every outstanding obligation. There is no negotiation involved, no shared checking account that requires coordination. He pays what needs to be paid because that is how his structure works. His living space functions. It may not look like a magazine, it may be sparse or cluttered or somewhere in between. But the heat works, the plumbing works, the roof doesn't leak, or if it leaks, there's already a plan to fix it. He knows where the shutoff valves are. He knows which breaker controls which circuit. He has a toolbox or a list of contractors, or both. Problems get solved because he solves them. His health is managed to whatever degree he manages it. He goes to the doctor or he doesn't. But if he goes on schedule. He fills prescriptions. He monitors what he monitors. Nobody else makes his appointments or drives him there or asks afterward what the results were. He is the only stakeholder in his physical maintenance. His finances are organized. Checking, savings, retirement, maybe a brokerage account, maybe a pension, maybe a rental property or a paid-off mortgage. He checks his accounts. He understands compound interest. He knows what he has. His daily routine runs without external enforcement. He wakes when he wakes. He works, or he's retired, or he freelances, or he does something that fills the hours with purpose or at least structure. Nobody else sets the schedule. He defines his own rhythm and he maintains it. This is not loneliness dressed up as competence. This is actual competence, built over decades, refined through repetition, tested by difficulty and sustained through it. A man who has lived alone for 30 years and kept his life in working order has done something that requires real skill, real discipline, and real consistency. That should be visible before anything else. But everything just described is centralized. One person runs the system. One person understands it. One person knows where the documents are and what the passwords are. He knows how the accounts are organized, which bills are on autopay and which are manual. He knows what the insurance covers, when the car was last serviced, where the spare key is hidden. He knows the login credentials for the retirement portal. The efficiency of a self-managed life comes from centralization, and centralization works beautifully as long as the central operator is present and functional. When the central operator is absent, the system doesn't automatically transfer. It stalls. Not with a dramatic crash, a gradual loss of coherence, because nobody else knows how it fits together. A married man's spouse might not understand every detail of the financial architecture, but she usually knows enough to begin. She knows the bank. She knows the advisor. She knows where the file cabinet is. She has context. A man living alone has no default interpreter. His brother doesn't know his passwords. His niece doesn't know his financial advisor's name. His friend doesn't know the location of his will, if he has one. His neighbor has the spare key, but not the authority to access his accounts. The structure exists in full, but it exists inside one mind. And when that mind is no longer available, the structure becomes a puzzle that other people must solve without the guide who built it. A house can be perfectly constructed and still lack a set of blueprints. While the builder lives in it, that's fine. He knows every beam, every wire, every pipe. He doesn't need blueprints because he is the blueprint. Once the builder is gone, the house becomes a structure that other people must reverse engineer. Every decision they make about it will be slower, less informed and more prone to error than the decisions the builder would have made. A self-managed life has the same property. The man who runs it is the documentation. He is the organizational chart. He is the institutional memory. And when the institution is a single person, institutional memory is fragile in a way that no amount of competence can fix. The password problem makes this concrete. A man who manages his own finances has 6 to 12 active financial accounts: bank, brokerage, retirement, insurance, social security portal, maybe a utility account, maybe an investment platform, each with a username, a password, a two-factor authentication method tied to his phone, and security questions whose answers he chose a decade ago and remembers through habit alone. He navigates these systems fluently. He logs in, reviews, adjusts, logs out. The friction is zero because the friction was eliminated through years of repetition. Remove him from the equation and nobody knows the passwords. Nobody knows which bank holds the checking account. Nobody knows the name of the brokerage firm. Nobody knows that the auto pay for the mortgage comes from one account, not another, and that canceling the wrong one triggers a default. Nobody. Unless he told someone. Unless he wrote it down. Unless he created a document, a letter, a file, a list, anything that translates his operational knowledge into transferable information. Most men have not done this. The urgency is absent. The system works fine today. The day it stops working is the day he is not there to notice that it stopped. His home contains the same pattern, not just his possessions, but his system. The filing cabinet with the tax returns, the desk drawer with the insurance cards, the box in the closet with the birth certificate and the discharge papers and the title to the car, the shelf in the garage with the tools, each in a specific position because that position is where it belongs. He doesn't think about the organization. It's ambient. He reaches for a document and it's where he left it. He needs a record and he knows which folder it's in. The house is not just a shelter. It is a filing system, a workshop, a records room. And he is the only librarian. When the librarian is gone, the library doesn't burn down, but it becomes unreadable to anyone who didn't build the index. A brother walks in and sees a house full of stuff, not a system, stuff. Drawers that need to be opened and sorted, closets that need to be emptied, file folders that might be important or outdated, and there's no way to tell without reading every page. A computer locked with a password nobody has, a phone that stopped ringing 2 weeks ago. This is the natural consequence of centralized knowledge meeting an absence of documentation. The surface is stable. That is the truth. The man has earned that stability through individual effort. It was not given to him. It was not inherited from a household structure. But stability and continuity are not the same thing. Stability is the condition of a system operating well in the present. Continuity is the capacity of a system to operate well after its primary operator is no longer involved. A man can have perfect stability and zero continuity planning. In fact, the more perfect the stability, the less urgent the continuity planning feels. When everything works today, tomorrow's absence seems theoretical, a problem for later. Later arrives on its own schedule, and when it arrives, it does not check whether the paperwork is complete. In his 20s and 30s, money meant options. It meant not being stuck. It meant the ability to leave a bad job, move to a different city, absorb an unexpected expense without going into debt. Money was a shield, and a man who built that shield on his own, without a partner's income or a family safety net, understood its value with particular clarity. There were years when the shield was thin, when the checking account balance on Thursday determined what he ate on Friday, when a car repair meant 2 months of recalculated budgets, when the gap between income and disaster was narrow enough to feel in his chest. Those years taught him something that men with dual-income households may never learn in the same way. They taught him that money is not abstract. It is the physical distance between stability and collapse. And the man who has personally measured that distance, in dollars, in a studio apartment, in a city where nobody owes him anything, does not forget the measurement. In his 40s, money began to mean proof. Proof of discipline, proof of restraint, proof that the life he was living, however unconventional it might look to others, was producing tangible results. The retirement account growing, the savings cushion thickening, the absence of debt. These were not just financial facts. They were evidence that his approach to life was working. He could see it in the numbers. Not in the mirror, not in other people's approval, not in social validation, in the numbers. The quarterly statement was his report card, and he earned it alone. That mattered. That still matters. A man who has no one to confirm his trajectory except the numerical record of his own discipline develops a specific kind of relationship with financial documentation. It is not vanity. It is verification. The only verification that doesn't depend on another person's opinion. Past 50, money is beginning to ask a different question. Not what it protects him from, not what it proves, but what it is for after the protection and the proof are no longer needed. If he has no children to educate, no spouse to provide for, no household to sustain, the traditional purposes of accumulated wealth begin to thin. The money is still there. It still grows. It still gets monitored and rebalanced and reported on quarterly statements. But its forward purpose is becoming less clear. It was earned through labor and restraint. It represents years, not just dollars. Years of effort, years of choice, years of saying no to things so that the number on the statement could say yes to something in the future. And the future is asking, yes to what? That question sits right next to the blank beneficiary line. They are the same question, wearing different clothes. A stable life can remain structurally unfinished when continuity depends on a person who has never needed one. There is a myth that circulates quietly in American life. By the time a man reaches a certain age, it will be obvious who matters. The myth assumes that decades of living sort people naturally into a hierarchy. Closest relatives rise to the top. Trusted friends occupy a clear middle tier. Everyone else falls away. And when a form asks you to name a beneficiary, you simply read the hierarchy from the top down. For many people, this is roughly accurate. Years of shared holidays, shared addresses, shared crises, and shared checking accounts produce a relational order that feels almost automatic. The spouse is first, the children are next. The will writes itself because the life wrote it first. But for a man who is never married and has no children, the hierarchy may not have sorted itself that way. His closest relative may not be his closest person. The sibling he shares blood with may occupy a very different position than the friend he shares trust with. The person he would call in an emergency may not be the person he would entrust with financial stewardship. The person he loves in his own quiet way may not be someone he would ever describe using that word. The categories overlap, they blur, they contradict. Family proximity is assigned by birth. Personal proximity is built by experience. A man may have a brother he respects but does not confide in, a sister he remembers fondly but hasn't visited in years. These are legitimate relationships. They carry real history, but they may not carry the weight that a beneficiary designation implies. The friend he trusts most may not be good with money. The niece he admires may be 26 and not yet stable in her own finances. Trust and competence are different qualities. A beneficiary designation quietly asks for both. A financial advisor or executor might be the most capable handler of the assets, but they are not the intended endpoint. The money is supposed to go to a person or a purpose, not merely be processed efficiently. And some designations create complications beyond the line itself. Naming a friend may require explanation to family members. Naming a charity may require structural planning. Naming multiple people with unequal percentages creates interpretation where the man intended simplicity. The person who meant the most may be the hardest to name, precisely because the meaning is complex and doesn't reduce to a percentage without loss. Most conversations about estate planning fail this man. They assume the problem is motivational, that he's procrastinating or fearful or in denial, that he needs a nudge, a reminder, an emotional appeal, that the barrier is psychological and the solution is encouragement. For many never-married men past 50, the barrier is architectural. The life they've built doesn't generate an obvious answer to the question. No amount of motivational language changes the underlying math of relational ambiguity. He doesn't need to be told to fill in the form. He needs to solve a design problem that the form was not designed to accommodate. And it's worth acknowledging something that rarely gets stated in financial or legal conversations about this topic. The man at the table is not an edge case. He is a demographic reality. The United States has roughly 15 to 18 million men over 50 who have never married. That number has been growing for decades. It will continue to grow. These men are not clustered in any single geography, profession, or income bracket. They live in suburbs and cities and rural areas. They work in offices and on job sites and in home-based businesses. They are, in aggregate, one of the least discussed demographic groups in American financial planning. Estate attorneys see them occasionally. Financial advisors encounter them, but the industry has not adapted its language, its tools, or its assumptions to serve this population specifically. The forms still say primary beneficiary and assume the answer is a spouse. The financial planning software still models dual income households. The retirement seminars still feature couples holding hands on a beach. The estate planning checklist still begins with, discuss with your partner. None of this is hostile. All of it is irrelevant to the man at the table. And irrelevance, sustained over decades, becomes a kind of invisibility. The man is present in the system. He contributes, he pays premiums, he files returns, he funds accounts. But the system has never looked at him directly. It has looked through him, treating him as a deviation from the assumed norm rather than a category with its own structural logic. He may have noticed this over the years in small ways. The insurance agent who asked about his wife and then stumbled slightly when corrected. The HR benefits presentation that addressed every scenario except his. The online retirement calculator that required inputs for spouse's age and number of dependents before it would generate any projection at all. And when he entered 0 and 0, the output felt like it was describing someone else's future. These are not injuries. They are paper cuts. They accumulate over years, and they create a quiet certainty. The system was not designed for him. He uses it, he navigates it, he even excels within it. But the assumptions baked into its architecture belong to someone else. That invisibility is part of what makes the blank beneficiary line so persistent. He has never been given a framework for answering the question that fits his actual life. He has only been given frameworks designed for other lives. And adapting those frameworks to his situation is work that falls entirely on him, with no institutional support. The man at the table is not the one who failed. The system around him simply never built a path for where he actually stands. The distinction to keep in mind is this: there is a difference between possessing assets and directing them. Owning something and controlling where it goes are not the same activity. One is accumulation, the other is allocation. They require different kinds of decisions made at different stages of life. A man can be excellent at accumulation. He can earn well, save consistently, invest prudently, and build a financial structure that would impress any advisor. But accumulation without allocation is a system with an open endpoint. The pipe runs cleanly for decades and terminates without a valve. When a man dies without a named beneficiary on a retirement account, the assets typically pass to his estate. That sounds neutral. But passing to the estate means the money enters probate. Probate is not a smooth handoff. It is a legal process with timelines, costs, potential disputes, and rules that vary by jurisdiction. In probate, a court determines distribution. If there's a will, the court follows it, subject to legal challenges. If there is no will, the court follows intestacy laws, which distribute assets according to a statutory hierarchy of relatives. The man's preferences, if he had any, are irrelevant unless they were documented. For a man with no spouse and no children, probate becomes a routing problem. The court works down the statutory hierarchy: parents, siblings, nieces and nephews, cousins. If no relatives are found, the assets may eventually escheat to the state. None of this is dramatic. None of it makes headlines. It simply happens, quietly, slowly, expensively, and in a direction the man may never have chosen. What makes this harder to see is that the consequences don't arrive at once. They unfold over months, sometimes years. A retirement account with no named beneficiary may take 6 months to distribute through probate. During those 6 months, the market moves. The account may gain or lose value while it sits in legal suspension. Nobody is managing it during that period because the man who managed it is dead and the court has not yet authorized a replacement. A life insurance policy with a deceased beneficiary, a parent who died 10 years ago, enters a claims dispute. The insurance company cannot pay a dead person. The policy requires a living beneficiary. If none is named, the benefit may revert to the estate, and the estate enters probate, which involves an attorney, a filing fee, a court date, and a timeline that stretches from months to years, depending on the jurisdiction. A bank account with no designated payable on death recipient may be frozen the moment the institution receives a death certificate. Frozen means no disbursements. Frozen means the auto pay for the mortgage bounces. Frozen means the electric bill goes unpaid. Frozen means the carefully maintained credit score begins to unravel, not because the man was irresponsible, but because the system he designed had exactly one authorized operator, and that operator is no longer available. These are not disaster scenarios. They are standard procedural outcomes. They happen thousands of times a year across every state. And they happen not because institutions are vindictive, but because institutions follow rules. And the rules require explicit instruction. When instruction is absent, the rules default to process. And process is slow, costly, and indifferent to personal history. Many men who have been responsible their entire lives assume, reasonably, that their intentions are known. They believe the people around them understand what they would have wanted. They believe common sense will prevail. But common sense does not govern estate distribution. Law governs estate distribution, and law does not accept implicit understanding as evidence. It accepts documents, signed forms, notarized instruments, filed designations. A man may have told his friend over a beer that he wants his savings to go to his niece. He may have said it clearly and specifically. But if that intention was never recorded in the format the system recognizes, the intention does not exist in the system's eyes. Verbal intention is not legal instruction. This is one of the quietest disconnections in American life. A man who communicates clearly in every other domain may discover, posthumously, that his financial clarity was never translated into the language institutions require. And then there are the outdated designations. Some men did fill in the beneficiary line at some point, maybe decades ago, when they opened the account. when the balance was small and the stakes felt proportionally low. A parent's name, perhaps, a parent who is now deceased. The form still lists them because no one updated it. A sibling's name from a period when the relationship was closer. The relationship has since cooled, but the form didn't move because the man never revisited it. An ex-partner's name from a relationship that ended 10 years ago. A generic designation made under mild pressure. An advisor or an HR representative suggested he fill something in, and he wrote a name quickly, not because it was right, but because the form demanded completion. Stale paperwork creates a specific kind of risk, not disaster, misalignment. The money goes to the name on the form, and the name on the form represents a version of the man's life that no longer exists. Revision feels heavier than it should. To change a beneficiary is a small administrative act. It takes minutes, but the administrative simplicity masks the relational weight. To remove a sibling's name is to make a statement, even if the sibling never sees the form. The man knows, and he knows what removing that name implies. To add a new name is to elevate someone into a position of significance that may or may not be mutual. To split designations among multiple people is to assign percentages, 70% to one, 30% to another. Each number carries implication. Equal shares suggest equal importance. Unequal shares suggest hierarchy. Every option is loaded, and the loading comes from the fact that in the absence of a default heir, every choice becomes a statement rather than a formality. Institutions are not cruel. They are indifferent in the way that a process is indifferent. They follow rules. They sort, confirm, route, process. When a beneficiary line is blank, the institution does not pause. It does not convene a committee to determine the man's wishes. It does not interview his friends or search his correspondence for clues. It applies the default procedure and moves forward. A man's private complexity is converted into institutional simplicity. His nuanced web of relationships becomes a ranked list of legal categories. His decades of carefully managed autonomy are reduced to a standard disbursement protocol. He spent a lifetime resisting other people's assumptions about how his life should be organized. If the forms are blank, assumptions are exactly what govern the outcome. There is a particular kind of friction that emerges from all of this. Not dramatic, not the kind that produces lawsuits among wealthy families, just ordinary friction. Administrative drag. Someone has to figure out the accounts. Someone has to contact the institutions. Someone has to provide death certificates to banks and brokerages and insurance companies. Someone has to navigate probate if one is triggered. Someone has to make phone calls, fill out forms, wait on hold, send documents, follow up, wait again. For a married man, that someone is usually the spouse. She has standing. She has context. She has authority. For a man without a spouse, that someone is whoever steps forward. A sibling who may not know the man's financial life. A niece who may be in a different state. A friend who has no legal standing and must wait for the court to appoint someone. A public administrator who has never met the man and is processing his case alongside dozens of others. The friction is not about bad people. It is about mismatched systems. A life of precision handled after the fact by people without the man's precision, using processes designed for a different kind of life. There is a version of this story that plays out in real time, in kitchens and living rooms across the country, and it looks nothing like what the man imagined. His friend gets a phone call, or his brother gets a phone call. Someone has died. The initial shock passes in hours. The grief, if it comes, takes whatever shape it takes. But within days, sometimes within hours, the practical questions begin. Does he have a will? Where is it? Who is his attorney? Did he have life insurance? Where's the policy? Which bank did he use? Is there a mortgage? Who has the key to his house? Is the car in his name only? What about the retirement accounts? The person on the other end of these questions may not have answers to any of them. The person may be a brother who lives in another state and hasn't been inside the man's house in 3 years. Or a friend who knew him well but knew nothing about his financial life, because men in this demographic do not typically share financial details with their friends. The conversation over beers covered sports, politics, work, and memory. It did not cover account numbers, insurance carriers, or the location of a safe deposit key. So the person begins to investigate. They drive to the house. They let themselves in with a spare key if one exists. If not, they call a locksmith. They stand inside a house that is both familiar and suddenly foreign. Familiar because the furniture is the same, the smell is the same, the jacket is still on the hook by the door. Foreign because every drawer, every cabinet, every folder is now a source of unknown information that must be opened, read, assessed, and categorized. They find a stack of bank statements in a desk drawer. They find an insurance policy in a filing cabinet. They find a laptop they cannot unlock. They find a phone that asks for a passcode. They find a folder labeled Important that contains some documents from 2014 and nothing more recent. They do not find a beneficiary designation form. They do not find a will. They do not find a list of accounts. They do not find instructions. And so they begin the slow, expensive, uncertain work of reassembling a man's financial life from fragments. They are not qualified for this work. They were not trained for it. They are doing it because someone has to, and they are the person who stepped forward. This is what a blank beneficiary line produces. Not immediately, not dramatically, but eventually, and with a quiet relentlessness that does not stop until every account is closed, every asset is distributed, and every form is filed. The man who managed his own life with such precision would not have wanted this. He would have handled it differently. He would have had a system, but the system was him, and he is gone. Beneath the administrative surface, something else is operating, something that touches the blank beneficiary line but is not, strictly speaking, about money. It has to do with meaning. The kind of meaning a man confronts when the systems he interacts with are asking him to translate his private life into a public format, and the translation doesn't go smoothly. A beneficiary designation is technically a financial instruction, but it is also, functionally, a statement about human connection under institutional conditions. It asks a man to identify, in a format that a computer can process, the person or purpose that represents the continuation of his economic life. For a man with a family, that translation is nearly automatic. The family is the continuation. The money flows into the structure that was already there. For a man without that structure, the designation is asking him to create a continuation that doesn't already exist, to assign direction where no automatic direction has been generated by the normal mechanisms of marriage, parenthood, and household formation. That is a fundamentally different task. It is harder not because the man is less capable. It is harder because the infrastructure of meaning that most people rely on was never built in the conventional shape. Independence was not, for most of these men, a defiant posture. It was a workable solution to the life they found themselves in. Some chose it deliberately. Some arrived at it by elimination. Some would describe it as a preference, and some would describe it as a circumstance. But the common thread is that independence became the operating system. And for decades, it worked. The efficiency of solitary life is real. A man who runs his own household, his own schedule, his own finances, and his own maintenance has eliminated an enormous amount of the friction that characterizes shared living. He has traded the benefits of partnership for the benefits of sovereignty, and the trade has produced a functioning life. This should not be romanticized. Sovereignty has costs. There is the Thanksgiving where he drove 4 hours to sit at a sibling's table as the only adult without a partner. and drove 4 hours back the same night because staying over felt like a concession he wasn't willing to make. There is the surgery he drove himself home from, against medical advice, because the alternative was asking someone a favor that felt larger than the procedure itself. There is the night the furnace failed in February, and he spent 3 hours on the floor with a flashlight and a manual, not because a repair person wasn't available in the morning, but because waiting until morning felt like a failure of the system he was supposed to manage. These are not complaints. He would not describe them as complaints. They are data points in a life shaped by self-reliance. The Thanksgiving drive was fine. The surgery healed. The furnace was fixed. Each episode confirmed the operating principle. He could handle it alone. And handling it alone was the standard he set for himself. And the standard was met. And the meeting of the standard was its own form of validation. But the costs are real, and they accumulate in places that don't appear on a balance sheet. In the number of people who have a key to the house, in the number of people who know his blood type, in the number of people who would notice within 24 hours if he didn't answer his phone. These are not metrics of loneliness. They are metrics of structural redundancy, and the number is lower than the system requires for sustainable continuity. The man who lives alone at 55 or 60 is not a project to be solved. He is a person whose life reflects a set of decisions and adaptations that produced stability. But stability built on a single point of reliance is, by engineering standards, a system with a known vulnerability. Stability reveals its limits not because stability fails, because stability was designed for a specific purpose, and that purpose has a boundary. The purpose of a self-managed life is to function well in the present, to handle what today requires, to solve problems as they arise. The boundary of a self-managed life is the future that lies beyond the self. A married man's life is co-managed, and co-management has an automatic continuity feature. When one manager is gone, the other continues. The structure does not collapse because the structure was never dependent on a single operator. A self-managed life has no such redundancy. When the operator is gone, what comes after is not a continuation. It is a cleanup. When a man who has managed everything himself becomes permanently absent, someone else arrives to sort through what he left behind. They are not continuing his work. They are interpreting it, reconstructing it, trying to understand a system they did not build and were not trained to operate. The accounts remain open. Auto pay continues to withdraw from the checking account. The mortgage or rent continues to process. The electricity stays on. The subscriptions renew. For the first few weeks, the infrastructure of a self-managed life runs silently on the momentum the man created while he was still present. The machine doesn't know he's gone. Then the entropy begins. Mail accumulates. An account overdrafts because a deposit didn't arrive. A subscription charges a credit card that nobody is monitoring. A bill goes unpaid because the man's calendar reminder only sounded on his phone, and his phone is locked on a nightstand in an empty house. Whoever steps in, a sibling, a friend, a court-appointed administrator, enters the system midstream. They are trying to manage what they don't understand. They're making calls to institutions that ask for account numbers they don't have, confirmation codes sent to a phone they can't access, answers to security questions they have never heard asked. None of this is catastrophic. All of it is avoidable. And all of it is happening because the man who ran the system never translated his knowledge into a format someone else could use. The concept of legacy presses on this conversation, whether the man wants it to or not. Many never-married men resist the word. It sounds grandiose. It sounds like something for people who build hospitals or endow university chairs, a word for men with dynasties. But legacy, in its mechanical sense, simply means what remains and what form it takes. If he dies with a retirement account, that account is his legacy whether he planned it that way or not. If he dies with a house, the house is his legacy. If he dies with a car, a storage unit, a savings account, a collection of tools, a library, a closet full of records, those things are his legacy in the most literal sense. They remain, and someone must deal with them. There is a storage unit industry in this country that profits from the physical residue of lives that ended without clear instructions. Furniture, boxes, personal effects, equipment, tools, books, photographs. The accumulated weight of decades sitting in a climate-controlled room paying monthly rent from an account that will eventually run dry. Someone, eventually, will have to open the door and decide what to keep, what to sell, what to donate, what to discard. Every decision will be a guess. Every guess will be informed by too little information. A man may not think of his retirement account in the same terms as a storage unit, but the principle is identical. Both contain the residue of effort. Both require someone to sort, interpret, and distribute. Both become more complex in the absence of instructions. The question is not whether a legacy exists. The question is whether it was shaped by the man or shaped by his absence. When a man asks himself who should receive what he's built, he is asking a series of nested questions that have been accumulating quietly for years. There is the question of trust. Who can be relied upon to handle this properly? Who will be honest? Who will follow through? There is the question of fairness. Does this designation make sense given the relationship? Would it create imbalance? There is the question of symbolism. The named person will know they were named. Others may know they were not. The designation becomes a social document, even though it was intended as a financial one. There is the question of identity. If the money goes to a family member, it suggests family mattered most. If it goes to a friend, it suggests friendship defined his life. If it goes to a charity, it suggests a cause outweighed personal connection. Every designation is a sentence in a story the man may not want told in those terms. And there is the question of continuation itself. When a man has lived without producing the traditional markers, children, household, lineage, he may not have a clear answer to the question, what part of my life should continue after me? Not because nothing mattered, because what mattered may not have a standard form. He may have mentored younger colleagues at work, quietly, without calling it mentoring. He may have maintained a cabin, a workshop, a garden that embodied something about how he thought life should be lived. He may have supported a niece's education through gifts that were never tracked or acknowledged publicly. He may have kept a friendship alive across decades through the unglamorous work of showing up, calling back, and remembering what was said last time. These contributions do not appear on beneficiary forms. They do not have account numbers or transfer protocols. They are the invisible yield of a private life, and they are real, and they have value, and they are not convertible into institutional language. The form does not have a line for the way I showed up. It does not have a field for the things I quietly maintain. It has 3 lines: name, relationship, percentage. And the man must somehow compress the full output of a life into those lines, or accept that the lines cannot do justice to what they represent. That compression is the source of the discomfort. Not weakness, not avoidance. The honest recognition that a form designed for simplicity is being asked to carry complexity. This is the controlled destabilization. Not panic, not crisis. A quiet encounter with the fact that a competent, dignified life still contains an unresolved structural question at its core. The question is not why he didn't get married. That is someone else's question, asked from someone else's framework. Irrelevant. The question is not whether he's happy. That is a therapeutic question, and this is not therapy. The question is, what happens to the structural output of a life when the life was optimized for operation rather than transmission? A man built a system. The system works. The system produces value. But the system has no succession plan. This is not a moral statement. It is an engineering observation. There is a specific feeling that arrives when a man looks at a blank beneficiary line and realizes the difficulty is not finding someone worthy. The difficulty is that his life was never organized to produce a kind of relational accounting that translates into 3 lines on a form. He has lived by doing, by solving, by maintaining, by showing up and handling things. His worth has been demonstrated through competence, not through declaration. He has not been in the habit of naming what matters because what matters was always evident in behavior. His loyalty showed in presence, not in statements. His care showed in action, not in percentage allocations. He has been fluent in the language of doing. The system is asking him to speak the language of designating. Those are not the same dialect. Here is a moment that happens more often than anyone discusses. A man is sitting in a doctor's waiting room. Routine appointment. There is a clipboard in his hand. The form asks for an emergency contact. He writes a name, maybe his brother, maybe a friend. He writes a phone number from memory. He hands the clipboard back. And as it leaves his fingers, he realizes he hasn't told the person listed that they are the name on the form. He realizes that if something happened in this building today, the phone would ring, and the person on the other end would receive the call with no preparation, no context, and no authority. He sits back down in the plastic chair and reads a magazine he doesn't care about. The thought passes. The appointment happens. He drives home. He doesn't bring it up with the person he listed. The moment dissolves, but the form is still there. The name is still there. And the gap between the name on the paper and the actual preparedness of that person remains exactly as wide as it was before the clipboard was handed in. These small moments accumulate. Beneficiary forms, emergency contacts, health care proxy questions, insurance designations. Each one reveals the same gap. Each one passes. Each one leaves the same quiet residue. There is another version of this moment. It happens at a hospital, visiting someone else. A friend, maybe, or a colleague. The man sits in the visitor chair and watches the system work. Nurses come and go. A doctor explains something to the patient's wife, who nods and asks the right questions because she has context. She knows his medications. She knows his allergies. She knows his history. She is listed on every form. She is authorized to make decisions. The man in the visitor chair does not envy the situation. Nobody envies a hospital room. But he notices quietly that the system functions because a person is designated. The machine has a human interface. The patient is not alone in the administrative sense, even when he's unconscious. Driving home, the man may think, if I were in that bed, who would the nurse call? Who would the doctor explain things to? Who would be listed as the person authorized to make decisions if I couldn't make them for myself? The answer might be clear, or it might not. And if it's not, the man does not panic. He adjusts his mirror, checks his speed, and drives home. The thought folds back into the background of his mind, where it joins the other unfinished items on a list he doesn't write down because the list doesn't feel urgent. It isn't urgent until the day it is. And on that day, urgency and opportunity will not coexist. There is a particular quality of evening that belongs to a man who lives alone and has spent the day thinking, even slightly, about these questions. The house is quiet. The television may be on, or it may not. The dishes are done, or they are waiting. The routines proceed. But somewhere behind the routine, the thinking continues. He may find himself standing in the hallway between the kitchen and the bedroom, not heading in either direction, just standing. Not in distress, in thought. The kind of thought that has no language yet. The kind that sits in the body as a weight rather than in the mind as a sentence. He has handled hard things before. Career setbacks, health scares, financial uncertainty. The slow dissolution of friendships that once felt permanent. He handled all of them the way he handles everything, by assessing the situation, determining the next action, and executing it. But this particular question resists that approach. Because the next action is clear, fill in the form, and the execution is simple, write the name. What is not simple is the meaning that the act carries. And meaning, for a man who has lived by doing rather than declaring, is a terrain without familiar landmarks. He goes to bed. He sleeps, or he doesn't, and in the morning the routine resumes. Coffee, news, the day's obligations. The form is still on the counter, the question is still unanswered, and the life continues to function with the same competence it has always shown. But the question is older now. It has been asked before by other forms, in other years, and the man is older now too, and the distance between "I'll get to it" and "I got to it" has not decreased. If anything, it has grown. A beneficiary form is, underneath its bureaucratic surface, a mortality document. It only becomes operative when the man is dead. Filling it in is an act performed in the present tense about a future condition the man will not experience. For a man who has managed his own life for decades without interference, this form is the moment where self-management acknowledges its own expiration date. The man who handles everything is filling out instructions for the day he can handle nothing. The man who depends on no one is creating a dependency chain that only activates in his permanent absence. The act of designating asks him to step outside the role that has defined him, the role of sole operator, the role of the person who runs the system. Filling in the form is, in a very quiet way, an acknowledgement that the system will outlast the person who built it, and that the system, without instructions, will behave in ways the builder did not choose. Decades of labor, restaurant, discipline, and careful management. 30 or 40 years of showing up to work, contributing to accounts, saying no to purchases, building slowly. All of that effort, all of that time, all of that quiet sacrifice, compressed into a few lines on a form. Name, relationship, percentage. It feels reductive, because it is reductive. The form has no field for what the money cost in terms of hours, choices, trade-offs, or years. It has no field for the early mornings or the overtime or the promotions that came through or the promotions that didn't. The form asks for an end point. The endpoint contains none of the journey, and the specific people he might consider each carry specific complications. A niece or nephew he's fond of but did not raise. The relationship is warm but curated. A few $1,000s is a gift. $100,000 is a life event. The man may not be sure the recipient is ready for a life event. A sibling with mixed history, good years and difficult years. The sibling may be fine. The sibling may also be married to someone the man doesn't trust, or the sibling might interpret the designation as something it was not meant to be. A friend, perhaps the most trusted person in his life. But naming a friend as beneficiary crosses a cultural threshold. The designation may create awkwardness in a relationship that survived precisely because money was never part of it. A charitable organization, a cause the man respects, but naming a charity as primary beneficiary feels, to some men, like an admission that no person was close enough. It may be a fine decision, but it may carry a symbolic weight the man doesn't want it to carry. The difficulty is not lack of options. The difficulty is lack of a recipient that fits the true role the money has played in his life. The people being considered do not know they are being considered. The niece doesn't know her uncle has been thinking about putting her name on a form. The friend doesn't know his name crossed the man's mind during a quiet evening. The charity's development office has no idea that a man in another city once looked at their website and wondered whether they were the kind of organization worth trusting with years of accumulated effort. These potential recipients are living their lives unaware that somewhere, inside a private deliberation, their name is being weighed against other names in a decision they have no voice in. The man knows that his designation will arrive, eventually, as information. The niece will learn she was named, or the friend will learn he was named. And in that moment, the recipient will begin to interpret. This is the nature of posthumous communication. It is one-directional. The man speaks through the form, and the form speaks after the man is gone, and there is no opportunity for clarification, amendment, or context. Some men try to solve this by writing letters of intent, explanatory notes. These can be useful. They can soften the bluntness of a percentage, but they are also inevitably incomplete, because a letter written today reflects the man's thinking today, and the day the letter is read may be years from now. There is no perfect instrument. There is only the choice between deliberate imperfection and default silence. He has been asked this question before and deflected it. A financial advisor at some point likely said, "Have you updated your beneficiary designations?" The man likely said yes, or said he'd get to it, or changed the subject with enough confidence that the advisor moved on. Advisors ask these questions as part of a checklist. They are not trained to sit in the silence that follows when the answer is uncertain in a way that cannot be resolved by the end of the meeting. An HR representative during open enrollment may have flagged the blank line. The man may have clicked past it. He may have chosen the path of least resistance because the enrollment deadline was approaching and the beneficiary question was the one question he didn't want to answer under time pressure. A lawyer, if the man has one, may have raised the topic. The man may have acknowledged it and deferred. In each of these encounters, the man was not avoiding the question because he didn't understand it. He was avoiding it because understanding it fully would require engaging with a set of considerations that his daily operating system was not designed to process on demand. The question doesn't get easier with repetition. It gets more familiar. But familiarity is not resolution. The money was never just money. It was compressed time. It was discipline made tangible. It was the man's labor converted into numerical form and stored against the future. Every dollar in that account was a dollar that was not spent on a trip, a meal, a piece of furniture, an upgrade, or a comfort that would have been reasonable to buy. Every dollar was a decision, a small act of faith that the future would require resources and that the present could absorb the cost of building them. A married man's savings often have a shared narrative. The money is for the family, for the house, for the children's futures, for the vacations together. The story of the money is embedded in the story of the household. The two are inseparable. A never-married man's savings have a personal narrative that is less clearly articulated, even to himself. The money is for security, for independence, for the ability to say no, for the margin that prevents desperation, for the quiet knowledge that whatever happens, the numbers are solid. But for security is a sentence without a second clause. Security from what? From instability, yes. From dependence, yes. From the specific vulnerability of being a single person in a system that assumes partnerships. But security from those things is a shield, not a destination. And shields, by their nature, do not have successors. A shield protects one person. When that person is gone, the shield doesn't protect anyone. It just sits there, inert, waiting to be melted down and reformed into something else. That is what the beneficiary form is really asking. Not whether the shield should be passed along, but what shape it should take next. And the future is arriving, not as a crisis, as a form. The form asks one question, and the question is mechanical. Where does this go? The man's answer, or his lack of an answer, will determine whether the final chapter of a disciplined life is written by the man or by the default settings of a system that never knew him. There is a specific kind of silence that settles into a man's house on an evening when he has been thinking about these things. Not a lonely silence, a working silence. The silence of a mind processing something that doesn't yet have a shape. He may wash the dishes. The water is warm. The plate is clean before he rinses it because he cleaned it after dinner the way he always does. But the routine is soothing, and he does it again anyway. He may check the news on his phone, scrolling past headlines without absorbing them. He may step outside for a few minutes and stand on the porch or in the driveway, not heading anywhere, just standing, feeling the temperature of the air, noticing that the neighbor's lights are on, noticing that the street is quiet. He has spent entire decades in this house, or in houses like it. The patterns of the evening are so embedded that they no longer require thought. The lock on the door, the thermostat setting, the lights turned off in the order he always turns them off. These patterns were not designed. They evolved, and they work. But tonight the patterns carry a slightly different weight, because the question is still sitting somewhere in the background of his thinking, not demanding attention, not creating anxiety, just present, the way a stone sits at the bottom of a clear stream. You can see it, you can ignore it, but you cannot unsee it once you've noticed it. He goes to bed at his normal hour and reads his normal book and turns off the light at his normal time. The form is still on the counter, or the tab is still open on the laptop. The question is still unanswered. That presence is not weakness. That presence is the beginning of something. There is one more dimension that warrants attention. It concerns time itself. A man past 50 has a particular relationship with time that differs from a man at 30 or 40. At 30, time felt abundant. Decisions could be deferred because the future was long. At 40, time began to feel finite, but still generous. Past 50, time changes character again. It does not become urgent necessarily, but it becomes countable. A man begins to know, roughly, how many working years remain, how many healthy years are likely, how many decades, at best, separate the present from the end. The arithmetic is not precise, but it is no longer abstract. Most decisions at this age can still be revised. A career can be adjusted, a routine can be changed. These decisions operate inside the window of the man's remaining active life. The beneficiary decision operates outside that window. It governs the period after the man's active life. There is no deadline because the man doesn't know the date, but there is a narrowing corridor, and he knows the corridor exists. The man may not feel this tension every day, but it is present when the form is on the table. It is present when the financial review comes around. It is present when a peer dies unexpectedly, and the conversation at the funeral includes someone saying quietly that the arrangements were complicated because nothing was in order. He went to one of those funerals 2 years ago. A man he'd known from work, younger than him by 3 years. Heart attack on a Saturday morning while mowing the lawn. The funeral was on a Thursday. It was a decent crowd. Co-workers, some family, a few friends from the neighborhood. Afterward, at the reception, he overheard a conversation between the man's brother and another relative. The brother was explaining that nobody could find the will, that the bank accounts were in the dead man's name only, that the retirement account might have an ex-wife still listed as beneficiary, that the house had a mortgage balance nobody was sure about. that the brother was now spending his own money on legal fees to untangle a life that, from the outside, had looked perfectly organized. The man listened. He didn't say anything. He ate a small sandwich. He shook a few hands. He drove home. He thought about it that evening. Not intensely, the way a man thinks about something that applies to him but isn't an emergency. The way he might think about a roof that needs replacing next year, not today. He recognized the parallel. He filed it mentally. And then the evening proceeded, and the week proceeded, and the recognition was not converted into action. That was 2 years ago. The form is still blank. This is how time works in this context. Not as a countdown, not as a ticking clock, as a series of small recognitions that accumulate without ever individually reaching the threshold of urgency. Each one is noted. Each one is filed. Each one dissolves into the routine of a life that remains, on its surface, fully functional. Time is not the enemy, but time is the context. And within that context, deferral is not the neutral act it once was. Where does the reconstruction begin? Not with emotion, not with confession, not with a dramatic reversal where the man suddenly sees his life differently and rushes to fill in the form with tears in his eyes. That would be fiction. The reconstruction begins with accurate naming. The problem this man faces is not a psychological problem. It is not a failure of attachment. It is not unresolved grief or latent fear or emotional avoidance disguised as stoicism. Those things may or may not be present. They are not the structural issue. The structural issue is this. A man with a non-standard life structure is being asked to complete a task designed for standard life structures. That is the problem. Accurately named. An accurately named problem is a problem that can be addressed without first having to become someone else. He does not need to transform. He does not need to open up. He does not need to revisit his childhood or perform emotional labor for the benefit of an audience. He needs to solve a design problem. How does a man with a self-contained life create a transfer structure that reflects his actual values, relationships, and intentions, using the tools the financial and legal system provides? That is a solvable problem. It is a hard one, but it is solvable. There is a mythology that says beneficiary designation is an emotional act, that it should flow from deep feeling, that the right answer will present itself when the man has done enough inner work. The reality is that it is a structural act. It may involve feeling, it will certainly involve judgment, but it does not require a spiritual awakening. It requires the same kind of thinking the man has applied to every other complex decision in his life. Assess the options, weigh the factors, accept imperfection, commit to a course of action. He has done this with career decisions. He has done this with financial decisions. He has done this with medical decisions. This is the same kind of work. The subject matter is different. The skills are the same. A beneficiary designation is not a love letter. It is not a final statement about who mattered most. It is not a ranking of human worth. It is a continuation instruction. The money will go somewhere. The assets will be processed. The system will route them. The only question is whether the routing reflects the man's judgment or the system's default. A continuation instruction answers one question. What should this money do next? And the answer can be entirely practical. It can protect someone, a niece starting her career, a nephew buying a first house, a sibling who may need medical care. The money can continue its original function, protection for someone else. It can sustain something, a scholarship, a conservation effort, a community institution. The money can be converted from personal protection into collective utility, It can reduce burden. If the man designates carefully, the people who handle his affairs will face less confusion, less expense, less delay. The money can perform one final administrative act, making the process smoother. It can express values, not sentimentally, structurally. If a man valued education, the money can fund education. If he valued independence, the money can fund someone else's independence. The designation can be a translation of character into allocation without ever becoming a performance. None of these options require the man to become someone he is not. They require him to be who he already is, with one additional layer of instruction. There is a man, hypothetical but not imaginary, who made the decision 4 years ago. He sat with the same hesitation, the same blank lines, the same internal resistance that comes from being asked to translate a private life into institutional language. He named his niece as primary beneficiary, 60%. He named a conservation organization he had donated to for 15 years as contingent beneficiary, 40%. He wrote it down. He submitted the form. He filed a copy. Then he did something that surprised him. He called his niece, not to tell her about the money, to tell her something simpler. He told her that he had put her name on some documents, and that if anything ever happened to him, she should contact his financial advisor. He gave her the advisor's name and phone number. She wrote it down. She asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. He changed the subject to her new job. The call lasted 12 minutes. It was the only conversation he has ever had with another human being about the structure of his financial afterlife. It was awkward. It was brief. It was sufficient. He didn't feel a rush of emotional relief. He didn't feel that something broken had been repaired. He felt what he usually feels after completing a necessary task that had been deferred too long. A mild lightness, the removal of a background drag. He hasn't thought about it much since. The designation sits in his files. It may need updating. His niece is now married. The conservation organization merged with another. Life moved on, as it does, and the forms may need to move with it. But the structure is in place. The line is not blank. And the difference between then and now is the difference between a system with an open terminal and a system with a defined one. No designation will be perfect. This is where many men get stuck. They hold each option to a standard of total accuracy that no single designation can meet. A man who has lived a complex private life for 50 or 60 years will not compress that complexity into 3 lines. No form is built for that. No document, no will, no trust, no letter of intent will perfectly capture what the money meant, what the relationships are, what the life was about. Perfection is not the standard. Deliberateness is the standard. A deliberate designation, even an imperfect one, is fundamentally different from a blank line. The blank line says nothing. The deliberate designation says something. And something, in this context, is enormously better than nothing. A man does not owe the world a flawless statement of succession. He owes the system a functional instruction. And a functional instruction can be revised, updated, amended. It is not carved in stone. It is entered on a form. Forms can be changed. The first designation does not need to be final. It needs to be real. Many men resist designation because it feels like disclosure. It feels like opening a private life to institutional scrutiny. The opposite is true. A man who leaves clear designations leaves less room for interpretation. His affairs are processed according to his instructions. Nobody needs to guess. Nobody needs to speculate. Nobody needs to reconstruct his relationships from fragments of evidence. The instructions are there. The system follows them. The matter is closed. A man who leaves no instructions leaves maximum room for interpretation. His relationships become the subject of legal proceedings. His finances become the subject of administrative inquiry. His private life becomes the material that institutions and family members must sift through to determine who gets what and why. Blank lines do not protect privacy, they destroy it. Clear instructions are the final defense of a private man's privacy. The tools exist, the forms exist, the systems are built. Most retirement accounts have beneficiary designation forms available online. Most insurance policies allow beneficiary changes through a phone call or a portal. Most brokerage accounts have a beneficiary section that can be updated in minutes. The administrative infrastructure is already waiting for input. The same is true for broader estate planning. A will can be drafted, a trust can be established, a power of attorney can be assigned, a healthcare directive can be completed. These are standard documents used by millions of people, and the legal professionals who create them handle cases like this routinely. The difficulty is not logistical, it is decisional, and that distinction matters. A man who tells himself the task is too complicated may be confusing the complexity of the decision with the complexity of the process. The process is simple. The decision is hard. But hard decisions are what adults make. A man who has navigated decades of professional, financial, and personal decisions without a co-signer has already proven he can make hard decisions alone. This is one more. This work is not separate from the man's identity. It is an extension of it. A man who has managed his life with competence, discipline, and precision for decades has already proven he can handle complex administrative tasks. He has already demonstrated the ability to make difficult decisions under uncertainty. He has already shown he can commit to a course of action and follow through. Beneficiary designation is one more administrative task. Harder than most because the subject matter is personal and the stakes are permanent. But it is not a different kind of task. Assessment, judgment, decision, execution. The man who fills in the form is not abandoning his identity as a competent operator. He is completing it. He is extending the same quality of management that characterized his active life into the final administrative requirement of that life. This is not surrender. It is authorship. Money, after the man is gone, becomes either directed or undirected. There is no third option. Directed money goes where the man said it should go. It fulfills an instruction. It serves a purpose the man identified, however imperfectly, while he was still alive and capable of choosing. Undirected money goes where the system sends it. It follows default rules. It enters probate or transfers by intestacy or sits in an account while institutions and courts determine its destination. A man who has spent his life making deliberate decisions has one more deliberate decision available to him. And the decision is about whether the final act of his financial life will reflect the same intentionality that characterized every other act. There is something worth saying about quiet authority because it is the register this reconstruction inhabits. Authority, real authority, the kind that characterizes a life well managed, comes from consistent, deliberate action performed without audience and without applause. The man who pays his bills on time has authority over his finances. The man who maintains his health has authority over his body. The man who shows up reliably has authority over his commitments. None of this was performed for spectators. There is a version of authority that the wider culture celebrates. It is loud. It involves titles, public recognition, visible power. It is the authority of men who run organizations, command stages, or accumulate followers. That version of authority is real, but irrelevant here. The authority that matters for this man is the authority of the person who kept the systems running. The authority of reliability over decades. The authority of a man whose word was good, whose bills were paid, whose obligations were met, whose life generated no drama for anyone else to manage. That authority is invisible to the public. It shows up in no database, no metric captures it. But the people who know this man, if asked directly, would describe him in terms that track precisely to authority. Reliable, steady, handles his business, doesn't ask for help unless it's real, gets things done, keeps his word. That description, unadorned and unpoetic, is a portrait of a man who earned his authority the slow way, through repetition, through follow-through, through decades of consistent, undramatic competence. Completing a beneficiary designation is one more act of that quiet authority. Not the loudest act, not the most visible, but perhaps the most structurally significant, because it extends authority beyond the man's own lifetime. A man who designates clearly does not lose control. He transfers control on his terms, according to his judgment, with the same competence that governed everything else. And that transfer, that final deliberate act, is not diminishment. It is the completion of a pattern that has defined the man's entire adult life. It says, I managed what I could for as long as I could, and when the time came to hand it off, I handled that too. There is a version of legacy that has nothing to do with monuments or family dynasties. It is the legacy of orderly conclusion, the legacy of a man who handled his affairs to the end, who did not leave ambiguity where clarity was available, who treated the final administrative requirements of his life with the same seriousness he brought to every other requirement. This is not a dramatic legacy. No building will bear his name, no scholarship committee will read a plaque, but the people who handle his affairs will know. The lawyer, the advisor, the institution, the person who receives the assets. They will encounter a system that was finished, not abandoned, finished. That tells a story, quietly, about the kind of man who built it. A man who was precise not for praise, but because precision was the standard he set for himself. A man who managed his life not for admiration, but because management was the form his responsibility took. A man who, even at the threshold where most people defer and hope for the best, chose to remain deliberate. There is something to be said for a man who runs his system all the way to the last line, not because anyone asked him to, not because a deadline forced his hand, because the standard he set for himself applied to every part of his life, including the final administrative corner that most people leave unswept. This is not heroism. It is consistency. The same consistency that paid the mortgage on time for 25 years. The same consistency that maintained the car, funded the retirement account, and kept the files in order. Extended one last time to one last form. And there is a dignity in that. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that exists in the records, in the files, in the completed forms that will be found by whoever opens the filing cabinet or logs into the laptop after the passwords have been located and the authorization has been granted. There is the matter of ambient weight, the quiet background pressure of an unfinished task. It is not always conscious. A man may not wake up thinking about his blank beneficiary line. He may go weeks without thinking about it. But the weight is there, the way an unpaid bill or an unanswered letter sits in the background of a man who otherwise handles everything. A small irregularity in an otherwise regular system. When the form is filled, the weight lifts, not with fanfare, with a settling. The same settling that comes from fixing a leaky faucet or filing overdue taxes or replacing the smoke detector battery that has been chirping for 3 weeks. The problem was not catastrophic, but it was there, and now it isn't. That is the reward of structural completion. Not joy, not peace, resolution. the quiet satisfaction of a system that no longer has an open loop. A man at a kitchen table, a form in front of him. An ordinary weekday, no emergency, no deadline. 2 lines that ask for names he has not yet written. At the beginning, the blank lines seemed to carry a disproportionate weight. The form was simple. The task was simple. But the pause was real. And the pause revealed something the man had not previously articulated, even to himself. A life can be well built and still reach a point where building is not enough, where maintenance is not enough, where competence in every visible domain does not automatically produce completeness in the one domain that lies beyond the man's own presence. That revelation is not comfortable, but it is not damaging. It is information. The same kind of information the man uses every day when he assesses a situation, identifies a gap, and takes action to close it. The gap is structural. The system he built lacks one final set of instructions, and the instructions are his to write. He does not need to name the perfect person. He needs to name a real one. He does not need to assign meaning that captures every dimension of his life. He needs to assign direction that reflects his best judgment at this point in time. He does not need to resolve every ambiguity in his relationships. He needs to make a decision that is better than silence. And he does not need to do this today. But he needs to do this. Because the difference between a deliberate life and an unfinished one is often a single line of text on a single document. A man sits at a kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. The form has been sitting there for a while. The coffee is cold. The reading glasses are where he left them. The rest of the house is in order because it always is. The bills are paid. The accounts are funded. The routine holds. Outside, the light is shifting toward late afternoon, the kind of light that settles into a house without anyone noticing the transition. The neighbor's car pulls into the driveway across the street. A dog barks once and stops. The sounds of a Tuesday proceeding as Tuesdays do. He picks up the pen, or he places his hands on the keyboard. He looks at the line. Primary beneficiary. He has looked at this line before, more than once, in different years, on different forms. Each time, the line seemed to carry the weight of a question he wasn't ready to answer. Each time, the form was set aside. The line remained blank. The question remained open. This time, something is different. Not a dramatic difference, not a transformation. The man is the same man he was an hour ago. He has not had a revelation. He has not been moved by a speech or confronted by a crisis or frightened by a diagnosis. Nothing external has changed. What has changed is the frame. The line is no longer a philosophical question. It is an administrative task. It is the last unchecked item on the list of a man who checks everything. And he has decided, in the quiet, undramatic way that he decides everything, that today is the day it gets handled. He understands what the line is asking. It is not asking him to summarize his life. It is not asking him to rank the people he has known. It is not asking him to make a declaration about love or connection or belonging. It is asking him to complete the circuit. A life of accumulation has a beginning. It has a long, disciplined middle, and it has an end. The beginning was the first paycheck that went somewhere useful. The middle was decades of responsible management. The end is this line. The line is not the most important part of his financial life, but it is the part that determines whether everything before it was directed or undirected, whether the system closes on his terms or on the system's terms. He knows the name he's going to write. Maybe he's known it for a while. Maybe the knowing was there all along, sitting underneath the hesitation, waiting for the hesitation to exhaust itself. Or maybe the name isn't perfect. Maybe it's the best available option rather than the ideal one. Maybe he'll revisit it next year. Maybe the percentage will shift. Maybe the contingent line will change. That is fine. First designations are not permanent. They are current, and current is enough. He writes the name. The pen moves, or the keys click, or the drop-down menu resolves into a selection. The line is no longer blank. The form is no longer unfinished. The system is no longer open-ended. Nothing in the room changes. The light through the window is the same. The house sounds the same. There is no catharsis. There is only this. A man who managed his life with care has extended that care to the one line that his daily competence did not automatically fill. He has not become sentimental. He has not become someone else. He has simply done what he does, assessed the situation, made a judgment, committed to a decision, moved forward. The form goes into the envelope, or the submission button is clicked. The task is done. He finishes his coffee, or makes a new cup, or stands up and moves on to the next thing, because there is always a next thing, and the next thing is handled the same way every other thing has been handled. Quietly, competently, without requiring anyone else's approval. The envelope goes in the outgoing mail, or the confirmation email arrives in his inbox, or the portal displays a green check mark next to a field that was red for years. The administrative world has received his answer. It does not applaud. It does not acknowledge the weight of the decision. It simply processes the input and moves on, the way systems do. But somewhere in the structure of his life, a circuit that was open is now closed. A line that was blank now carries a name. A system that was built for one now includes instructions for what happens after one. When no direct heir exists, the last act of responsibility is not accumulation, it is designation. His system is finished. The architecture holds. And the final page, the one that matters most to the people and institutions that will outlast him, says what he decided it should say. That is authority. Quiet authority. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that shows up in records, not in speeches. The kind that a man builds over a lifetime and deploys, one last time, on a Tuesday afternoon at a kitchen table, with a form that is no longer blank.